Okay, so let's dive into this case, the death of Sherri Lynn Malarik. It's a case that's been cold for years, and it's really fascinating.
Yes, it is.
Picture this. A typical Friday night in Florida. Kids are running around. It's a family sleepover. Pizza's on the way. You've got a loving mom at the center of it all. And then silence.
It's like a scene from a movie.
Right. Sherri just vanishes.
Mm.
The next morning, her body is discovered in her minivan just a few miles from her home. She was shot, execution style.
Brutal.
So who would want this seemingly ordinary woman dead? And why?
Well, that's what makes this case so compelling. On the surface, you have this normal family gathering, and then bam, it turns deadly.
It's a real head-scratcher.
Totally. And it's frustrating because you have a victim who, by all accounts, was loved by her community, well-respected, led a normal life.
Yeah.
But someone decided to end it in such a violent way.
So how do we even begin to untangle this? Where do we start?
Well, let's go back to September 21st, 2001.
Okay, back to the beginning.
Sherri was hosting that sleepover for her kids and their cousins at their home in Cantonment, Florida. Everything seems pretty normal.
Games, pizza, the usual Friday night stuff.
Exactly. But around 6:30 p.m., things take a turn.
What happened?
Sherri tells her son, Jacob, that she's going outside to talk to her husband, Greg, who is working in the backyard.
Okay.
And that's where the mystery starts.
Because she never comes back inside.
Right. Greg later told investigators that Sherri mentioned she was going to run to the store quickly. But here's the thing.
What's that?
Her purse, with all her credit cards and checkbook, was later found in a drawer at home.
That's strange. Who goes to the store without their purse?
Exactly. It's a detail that just doesn't add up.
It makes you wonder if there's something more to the story.
Absolutely. And as the hours went by, the family started to worry, of course.
I can only imagine.
By the next morning, they knew something was terribly wrong.
Oh,
Sherri's sister, Tina, and her husband started searching for her.
they must have been frantic.
They eventually found Sherri's minivan in a Winn-Dixie parking lot about 8 miles from the house.
Oh, no.
And what they found inside was horrific. Sherri was dead. She had been shot twice in the head.
Oh, my gosh.
Her body was found on the floor of the minivan. The scene was chaotic. There were traces of blood even on a children's Bible, but there was no blood on the ground outside the van.
That's really odd.
And the way her body was crammed into the floorboard, it just felt off. For investigators, this was a huge red flag.
Suggesting that the van wasn't the actual crime scene.
Right. It looked like someone was trying to cover their tracks.
So, naturally, suspicion falls on Greg.
Of course. He's the last one who saw her alive, and his actions afterwards were just strange.
What did he do?
Well, he showered and changed his clothes shortly after Sherri supposedly left for the store.
That's suspicious.
Very. From an investigator's standpoint, it just doesn't make sense.
It's like he was trying to get rid of evidence.
Exactly. And to make things even more suspicious, forensic tests found gunshot residue on Greg's hands and pants.
So he had fired a gun recently.
It definitely points to that.
But wait, you said Sherri supposedly went to the store.
Yeah.
If she was killed somewhere else, why was her van in that Winn-Dixie parking lot?
That's another piece of the puzzle that doesn't quite fit. It turns out that Winn-Dixie wasn't even Sherri's usual grocery store.
Really?
Her family said she always shopped at Walmart or the commissary on the Navy base.
So why was her van there?
It seems like the Winn-Dixie parking lot was just a convenient place to dump the body.
So where did the murder actually take place?
Investigators started to think that Sherri was killed in her backyard while the kids were inside during the sleepover.
That's a chilling thought.
And there's this creepy detail. A neighbor reported hearing a popping sound that night, kind of like a firecracker or a bottle rocket.
Oh, wow.
So you have a potential murder scene, the suspicious husband, and then the missing piece, the murder weapon.
Did they ever find it?
No, the murder weapon was never found. They believe it was a small .25 caliber handgun.
So, without the gun, could they still tie Greg to the crime?
It was tough. They had the gunshot residue, his odd behavior, the holes in his story. But that crucial piece of evidence was missing.
So what happened? Did they arrest him?
No. The case went cold.
For how long?
For almost 2 decades. Can you imagine the frustration for Sherri's family?
That's heartbreaking. All those years with no answers, no justice.
It's a nightmare scenario. But then, in 2020, something happened. Jennifer Spohn, the woman Greg was having an affair with, contacted investigators.
Wait, she waited almost 20 years to say something.
Yeah, it was a long time.
What did she tell him?
She dropped a bombshell. She said that years ago, Greg confessed to her that he had killed Sherri.
Oh, wow. What did he say exactly?
Spone claimed that Greg told her he shot Sherri twice to make sure she was dead. She even said Greg had asked her to meet him at the Winn-Dixie parking lot that night.
To create an alibi.
Exactly. She drove him back to the house after Sherri's body was dumped.
So now they had someone putting Greg at the scene of the crime.
Right. This was huge for the investigators. Finally, after all these years, they had enough to arrest Greg.
And charge him with Sherri's murder.
Yes.
So, with Jennifer Spone's testimony, it seemed like they finally had a solid case against Greg.
It seemed that way. But remember, a lot of the evidence was still circumstantial.
Right, they still didn't have the murder weapon.
And Greg's defense team used that to their advantage.
How so?
They went after Jennifer Spone's credibility. They argued she was unreliable. I mean, why did she wait so long to come forward?
It does seem odd.
Right. They also suggested she might have had her own reasons for implicating Greg, maybe even revenge.
So they were planting seeds of doubt. Did it work?
Well, the first trial in 2022 ended in a mistrial. The jury was deadlocked. They couldn't agree on a verdict.
Wow.
But the prosecution decided to try again.
Hoping for a different outcome.
Exactly. But the defense doubled down on their strategy. This time, it worked.
What do you mean?
The jury found Greg Malarik not guilty.
He was acquitted. After all this time, all this evidence, he walked free.
He did.
Unbelievable. What happened to Jennifer Spone?
She went back to her life, carrying the weight of her choices. She said she regrets what happened and hopes Sherri's family can find some peace.
That's a lot to unpack.
It is. This case is full of twists and turns, and even after 2 trials, we're still left with so many questions.
It's hard to believe that after all this time and all we've discussed, the murder of Sherri Malarik is still officially unsolved.
It is, but it's a case that continues to intrigue and baffle.
It really makes you think.
It does, and it raises a question for all of us. What do you think happened to Sherri Malarik? It's really crazy how much time passed before they even arrested Greg, almost 20 years.
I know, it's wild. And I keep thinking about how much can change in that time. Memories get fuzzy, evidence can disappear, people move on with their lives.
Yeah, it's like trying to put together a puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the other half are faded. Like, why did Jennifer Spone wait so long to come forward? What finally made her break her silence after all those years?
That's the big question, right?
It is. And we may never know for sure. Maybe guilt got to her. Maybe she wanted revenge against Greg. Maybe she cut a deal with investigators. Who knows?
It's a lot to carry around, knowing that a potential killer is out there, and you have a piece of the puzzle that can change everything.
Absolutely. Talk about a heavy burden. It makes you think about all the things that might have been going through her head all those years. The fear, the loyalty, the guilt. It's just a very complex situation.
Yeah, no kidding. But whatever her reason, she did finally talk, and her testimony was enough to get Greg arrested and put on trial. But I'm still kind of stuck on the fact that he was acquitted, not once, but twice. How's that even possible?
It's pretty mind-blowing, right? I mean, they had her statement, they had the gunshot residue, they had the holes in Greg's alibi. But in the end, it all came down to reasonable doubt.
Because they didn't have the murder weapon.
Exactly. Without that gun, there was no direct link between Greg and the crime. And the defense, they did a good job of poking holes in the prosecution's case. They argued the gunshot residue could have come from somewhere else, that Jennifer Spone wasn't reliable.
So they basically created enough doubt to convince the jury that Greg might not have done it?
Exactly. In both trials, enough jurors felt there wasn't enough proof to convict him. And in our legal system, you have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, even if it means someone who might be guilty goes free.
Man, that must have been devastating for Sherri's family. To come so close to getting justice and then have it all fall apart not just once, but twice.
I can't even imagine. Talk about a roller coaster of emotions. It really shows you that the justice system isn't perfect. Sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, the truth doesn't come out and the right thing doesn't happen.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder if they could have done anything differently. Like, what if they had more advanced forensic technology back then? Would that have changed things?
Maybe. Think about DNA analysis. Nowadays, they might have been able to use DNA to tie Greg to the crime scene, even without the gun.
That's true. It's incredible how much forensic science has advanced in the last 20 years.
It really is. And there's always the possibility that something new could turn up, even now.
Like what?
A new witness, or maybe a piece of evidence that was overlooked before. You never know. And even though Greg was acquitted, if they found really strong new evidence, they could potentially charge him again.
There's still hope then.
There's always hope. Cold cases get solved all the time, and it's important to never give up on the truth,
I agree. So let's talk about that bag Jennifer's phone mentioned, the one she said had the gun in it. What happened there?
Oh, yeah, that's another one of those loose ends that keeps you thinking. Spahn said Greg gave her a bag and some clothes to get rid of after Sherri was killed. She said she tossed the bag, which she thought had the gun in it, into a river.
Did they ever find it?
Nope. Divers searched the river, but they came up empty. And that's part of what makes Spahn's story so hard to figure out. Did she really toss the murder weapon into a river? Or did she make that up?
She did have immunity, so she couldn't get in trouble for anything she said.
Exactly. So was she telling the truth? Or was she saying whatever she thought the investigators wanted to hear? We might never know for sure.
It's amazing to think that this one little detail, this one bag, could be the key to the whole case. If they found it, they might finally be able to solve Sherri's murder.
That's how it goes with these complex cases sometimes. You just never know what piece of information could crack it wide open. But the problem is, with a case this old, there's just so much information to sift through. Witness statements, forensic reports, phone records. It's a mountain of material.
And you're looking for a needle in a haystack.
You got it. It's entirely possible that somewhere in all that data, there's a clue that everyone missed. Maybe someone out there has a piece of the puzzle, but they don't even realize it.
It makes you wonder if keeping cases like this in the public eye could help. Maybe someone will hear about it and remember something they saw or heard back then.
I think that's a great point. Public awareness can be a powerful tool in cold cases. You never know when that one little piece of information might surface. So let's say, hypothetically, they did find some new evidence. What would it take to actually reopen the case?
That's a good question, especially since Greg was acquitted. Isn't there a law against trying someone twice for the same crime?
Yeah, it's called double jeopardy. But there are exceptions. If the new evidence is really strong and they couldn't have found it during the original investigation, they might be able to try him again. It's not easy, but it's possible.
So even after all this time, there's still a chance that justice could be served for Sherri.
There's always a chance. And as long as people care about this case, and as long as investigators are committed to finding the truth, that chance never completely disappears.
It's amazing to see that dedication, that refusal to give up hope, even after everything Sherri's family has been through.
It's truly inspiring. They haven't let the setbacks and roadblocks stop them. It speaks to the strength of the human spirit, I think, to the belief that every victim deserves justice, no matter how long it takes.
Absolutely. But all of this happened in a relatively small town, right? I'm curious how this case and the trials affected the people in Cantonment.
Yeah, it definitely had a huge impact on the whole community. Imagine living in a small town where everyone knows each other, and then something like this happens. It shakes things up in a big way.
It must have been really unsettling.
For sure. And then when the finger started pointing at Greg Malarik, it caused all kinds of tension. People took sides. Some believed he was guilty. Others thought he was innocent. It really divided the town.
It's like the whole town was trying to solve the mystery along with the investigators.
Exactly. And the trials didn't help. All that drama and uncertainty just kept the case alive in everyone's minds. It became part of the town's history, a story that people still talk about even today.
It's a reminder that a crime like this doesn't just affect the victim and their family. It affects everyone. It can leave a scar on a whole community, a wound that takes a long time to heal.
That's so true. And when there are so many unanswered questions, that healing process can be even harder. It's like this open wound that keeps getting reopened. People want answers, they want closure, and when they don't get it, it can really weigh on them.
It's a lot to carry. And I can't even imagine what Sherri's kids have gone through, having to live with this their whole lives.
It's heartbreaking, They lost their mother, and then they had to go through those awful trials where their father was accused of killing her. Talk about a nightmare scenario. It just goes to show how the impact of a crime like this can stretch across generations.
It's a stark reminder that there are real human beings at the center of these cases, people whose lives are shattered by violence.
Exactly. We can analyze the evidence and debate the legal stuff all we want, but we can't forget about the human cost of this tragedy. Sherri's kids, her family, their lives will never be the same.
It makes you think about how we approach cases like this, We need to be sensitive to remember that there are real people hurting behind all the headlines and courtroom drama.
I agree. And each of Sherri's children has dealt with their grief in their own way. Some have tried to move on to find peace quietly. Others have been more vocal, more involved in the search for answers.
I can only imagine how difficult it must be to grow up with this kind of shadow hanging over your life. To know that your mother was murdered and the case was never solved.
It's a burden no child should have to bear, and it reminds us that the ripple effects of violence can last for a lifetime, affecting not just the immediate victims, but everyone around them.
So even though Greg was found not guilty, this story isn't over for Sherri's family or for the community.
Not by a long shot. They're still living with the consequences of this crime and the search for the truth, for healing that goes on. After all this, I keep picturing that minivan, Sherri's minivan, just sitting there in that Winn-Dixie parking lot.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? It's such an ordinary place for something so awful to happen. It's almost like a symbol of the whole case.
I know what you mean. Like, on the one hand, you have this everyday, normal life, going to the store, picking up groceries, and on the other, you have this brutal, violent act. It's just jarring.
It's a reminder that this could happen anywhere to anyone. Like you're going about your day, and then suddenly everything changes.
It's a scary thought, and it makes you wonder, how do we deal with that? How do we make sense of something so senseless?
It's a tough question. But even with all the darkness in this case, all the unanswered questions, I think there's still some hope to be found.
Oh, where do you see that?
Well, I think about Sherri's family. They've been through so much, but they haven't given up. They're still fighting for justice, still keeping her memory alive. That takes incredible strength.
You're right. They've shown amazing resilience.
And the community, too, the people in Cantonment. They've rallied around the family, showing their support. Even though the legal system didn't give them a clear answer, they're still there for each other.
It shows the power of community, how people can come together in times of need.
Exactly. And I think it reminds us that even in the midst of tragedy, there's still good in the world.
It's good to remember that. And we can't forget, this case is still open.
Mhm.
Even though Greg was acquitted, there's always the chance that new evidence will turn up.
I was going to ask about that. Like with cold cases, don't they sometimes get solved years later?
All the time. Technology gets better, new witnesses come forward, you just never know. And even if we never get all the answers, the search for the truth is still important.
It shows that we haven't forgotten, that we still care about what happened to Sherri.
I agree. So we've talked about the evidence, the suspects, the trials, but we still haven't really talked about the why. What was the motive? Why would anyone want to kill Sherri Malarik?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It's hard to wrap your head around.
It is. We can look at the evidence, the timeline, all that stuff, but trying to understand what goes on in someone's mind, why they would do something so terrible, that's almost impossible.
So are there any theories about why this happened?
There are a few, but none of them are perfect. The most obvious one is that Greg did it to be with Jennifer's phone. He was having an affair, and he supposedly told her that killing Sherri would be easier than getting a divorce.
That does seem like the most likely explanation.
It does. But remember, Greg has always denied it. And Jennifer Spohn's story isn't exactly airtight, so it's possible, but we can't say for sure.
What about other theories?
Some people think it could have been a random act of violence, like a carjacking gone wrong. But that doesn't really fit because her purse was found at home.
Right, nothing was stolen.
And then there are the more out there theories, like maybe Sherri stumbled onto something illegal happening at the Navy base, but those are just speculation. There's no evidence to back them up.
So we're left without a clear answer. It's frustrating to think that we might never know why this happened.
It's true, and I think it adds to the tragedy, Not only was Sherri's life taken away, but we don't even know why. It's like this senseless act hanging over everything.
Yeah. It's a lot to process. So what now? What happens next? I mean, the case is unsolved, but Greg Malarik has been acquitted. Is this just it?
Well, officially the case is still open, but it's unlikely there will be any movement unless some dramatic new evidence comes to light. It's a waiting game, really.
And what about Sherri's family
Mm.
and the people in Cantonment? How did they move on from this?
I think that's something we all struggle with. How do you find peace? How do you heal when something so terrible happens and there are no easy answers? It's a process and it's different for everyone. But I think what we've seen in this case, the way the community has rallied around Sherri's family, the way they've refused to let her memory fade, that's a sign of hope.
It shows the strength of the human spirit, the power of love and compassion to help us through even the darkest times.
Absolutely. And I think if there's one thing we can take away from all of this, it's that we need to look out for each other. If you see something that seems wrong, say something. Don't be afraid to speak up. You never know. You might be the one who helps prevent another tragedy like this from happening.
That's a powerful message. And I think it's a fitting way to honor Sherri's memory by trying to make the world a little bit safer, a little bit kinder.
I agree. And to our listeners out there, we want to thank you for joining us on this journey as we've delved into this complex and heartbreaking case. We may not have all the answers, but we hope that by exploring this story together, we've sparked some important conversations and reminded everyone of the importance of empathy, vigilance, and the unwavering pursuit of justice.
Thank you for listening.